Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Tuesday, August 26th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel founding editor David Horovitz. David, hi, how are you?
I'm good, Jessica, thank you.
It is day 690 of the war. Protesters blocked major highways across Israel this morning as another nationwide set of massive demonstrations for the remaining hostages began in the early hours of the day. U.S. President Donald Trump said the war in Gaza will reach a conclusive end in 2 to 3 weeks, while the IDF is currently looking into the Monday attack on Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, which killed at least 20 people, including 5 journalists, according to media reports. We'll talk about all of that, as well as David's trip down to Kibbutz Nir Oz on Friday. Stay with us. Okay, David, let's start with the demos, which are ongoing most massively in Tel Aviv's Hostages Square, where we have a reporter all day long, but really across intersections. And it's really in many different places across the day, with a massive demonstration or large demonstration planned for Jerusalem in the late afternoon, and then everyone gathering in Tel Aviv in the evening. And it's the second nationwide one following last week's. Wanted to hear your thoughts about it because, of course, there's that sense that we've had for many, many months. You know, is the government paying attention to this? Does it make a difference? Is it the right way to go? Is there anything else that hostage families can do? Your thoughts?
Well, I think the hostage families have been at a loss for a long time, and they're desperately trying to find ways to chivvy the government into, I'm talking about almost all of them, not all. There are some relatives of hostages who think that military pressure has to be unstinting, and that is the only way that Hamas is going to surrender the hostages, and in some cases they don't want to interact with Hamas indirectly at all. Well, I don't want the government to do that, but most of the families have come to the conclusion that the only way to secure as many hostages as possible, and hopefully all of them, is through an accommodation, an indirectly negotiated deal with Hamas. And one of the things that deeply grieves them is the sense that the Netanyahu coalition is messing around here, is changing its stance in ways that to the families at least do not make sense. In other words, in the past, until March, there was a phased process moving on that was an Israeli-backed arrangement that would have led to a comprehensive deal. It was meant to ultimately see the full withdrawal of the IDF, an end to the war and the release of all the hostages. And in a sense, that is, there are nuances here and it's complicated, but that's what Netanyahu ostensibly is demanding now, a comprehensive deal under which all the hostages are freed according to Israel's terms, rather than some kind of partial deal to which Hamas has now agreed. So there's this sense that if the government was genuinely seeking to prioritize, shall we say, the release of the hostages, then the conditions have been there, are there, and so on. And they're trying to, keep the issue in the headlines that they're certainly doing. We had a sort of nationwide strike. This is not the same today. This is not a sort of labor action, but this is multiple demonstrations, as you've said, to keep the issue at the top of the agenda. The cabinet in one of its forums is supposed to meet tonight. It's not entirely clear what will come out of that or what may come out of that. Netanyahu sent a statement a few days ago which said, I've instructed the start of negotiations at the same time as we're moving ahead with the expansion of the military operation into Gaza City. It wasn't clear what was meant by that. The only thing that I would add to this is the issue that the terms that Israel is understandably demanding. It's demanding the release of all the hostages, that Hamas lay down its weapons, that Gaza be demilitarized, and that a non-Hamas and non-PA Arab force take control of Gaza on the day after. Most of those conditions, most Israelis would agree with. They might argue about how to insert some kind of an Arab non-PA government in Gaza, but they would, broadly speaking, support those goals. The problem is they're not goals that anyone can seriously imagine can be negotiated with Hamas. And Hamas is not going to voluntarily lay down its arms. It's not going to demilitarize the strip and slink away. That's something that, to my mind, and I don't think the would be many people who would query this. This has to be negotiated with people other than Hamas, at least elements of it. Who are the people who are going to take over? Under what circumstances would they take over? If Israel doesn't want a PA role, then how does Israel see this panning out? Is there a sort of role for non-officially PA technocrats, as, for example, Egypt has suggested at certain points? That's what seems to be missing here. There's military action, there's military pressure on Hamas, and there are terms that Israel is seeking that surely are not going to be negotiable with Hamas. They need to be negotiated, and I think, by the way, the United States has a role to play here if it wants to. And it really seems to have taken a back seat lately in the negotiating efforts, bring together the potential regional players who would have a role here, the United Arab Emirates, the Egyptians, others, negotiate with Israel. These are states at peace with Israel or at normalized ties with Israel. Okay, so what's the framework that Israel can live with? How can we make this work? That, to me, seems to be a really cardinal missing element.
Okay, sticking with the U.S., let's say, for the moment, we had President Trump making that statement, which was not necessarily explained, which he said there would be a conclusive end to the war in Gaza in 2 to 3 weeks. What did you draw from that?
I don't know what to make of that. It's not the first time. I mean, Trump has a record of invoking 2 weeks, and it's not necessarily representing a confident knowledge that that particular timeline is going to play out. It may well be what he would hope would happen. We know, because he said this over and over, he wants to bring the war, or he wants the war to end very quickly, and he wants all the hostages out. And even yesterday when he was speaking, his Secretary of State, Rubio, was saying, yeah, we need the release of all hostages and we need Hamas to be destroyed and so on. So we would all want all of the hostages released in 2 to 3 weeks or sooner. We would all want Hamas destroyed. It's not clear why Trump is setting an ostensible timeline, and it's not clear that he genuinely thinks that it's viable. It may be a hope, it may be more than a hope, but it's not clear why one should think, this is going to happen, because he is the most powerful person in the world, I agree, but it's not clear why he thinks the processes and mechanisms would meet that timeline.
And then, in a sense, that headline juxtaposed with the attack on Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, which, according to reports, killed at least 20 people, including, according to reports, 5 journalists, which included one AP journalist. And I certainly was seeing different accounts about that from people who had also worked with this journalist. And I just kept on, looking at those 2 sets of headlines and what it all really meant. And of course, the IDF took responsibility for it later in the day. And as you point out, of course, this is all as you have Trump saying the war will come to an end in 2 to 3 weeks. We have the IDF ground troops in Gaza. We have massive demonstrations, and we have the Prime Minister Netanyahu talking about negotiations. So, honing in on Nasser Hospital, I'd like to hear what your thoughts were yesterday as this particular story was unfolding.
Well, indeed, the army is still investigating this. We don't have all the facts. It does appear that the army is taking responsibility. It's not clear why the army would have used tank shells to target whatever it was targeting in Gaza. There are military sources who've been saying that there were cameras set up at the hospital that posed a threat to troops. That has not been said officially by the army, which has expressed regret and is investigating. And Netanyahu's office, Netanyahu, therefore, we should say, put out a statement expressing deep regret at what he called a tragic mishap. We should add in context that the army has operated in Nasser Hospital not for a long time, because it was a place where I think I saw a statistic of 200 Hamas operatives who were captured there in the course of the war. There are multiple accounts, including from returned hostages who were held there, and know of other people who were held there. It is a functioning hospital at the moment, but it is certainly not a hospital clear of Hamas influence, shall we say. Anyone who's working there and any journalists who are based there, in one way or another, are within a Hamas, ambit. They wouldn't be able to be running a live feed there, as Reuters has been doing, without the permission of the relevant authorities, and the relevant authorities ultimately are Hamas. None of which really explains why 2 tank shells were fired. And we haven't had an official explanation. Like I said, we've had sources saying stuff about cameras, but the army is investigating and we'll know more about it. Trump didn't know about it when he was first asked about it yesterday. And then when he was told the details, he said he's not happy about it. He did say, and the war has to stop. He did not say, those terrible Israelis, which is basically what almost the rest of the world has been saying. Whereas Israel has not effectively said, none of this would be happening if Hamas returned the hostages and laid down its arms. I mean, those are wider contextual issues, but they're relevant. But the bottom line is something that the army regrets having done and is investigating is still being investigated.
Right. Okay, let's take a quick break. When we're back, let's talk about your visit to Nir Oz on Friday. Stay with us. Okay, so you took a trip down to Kibbutz Nir Oz, which is, as our listeners know, the kibbutz that was perhaps most terribly hit on October 7th. 1 in 4 people were killed or taken hostage on that day. People have not moved back to Nir Oz because there are very few houses left standing, about maybe half a dozen. Tell us why you were there, who you spoke to, what the visit was about.
Yeah, I was there it was not a visit arranged for journalists per se, although Ayala Metzger, who showed people around, I told her, of course, that I was a journalist and I might use whatever material was appropriate in my journalism, and therefore she would know that I would potentially talk about it as I am doing and or write about it. You're right that the kibbutz, first of all, obviously that the kibbutz was terribly, terribly, terribly badly hit. Hundreds and hundreds of terrorists entered the kibbutz in waves, and then looters, and almost every building was affected. It's just a very, very, very small number that were not targeted. And the army didn't get there until long after the last terrorist had gone. And as far as I know, I think there are still 9 people among the hostages for whom the kibbutz is still waiting. To say that the kibbutz is in ongoing trauma is almost banal, but of course it's the case. It's a terribly devastated place. Its proximity to Gaza, that's unsurprising to anyone who's internalized quite how close so many kibbutzim and communities were to Gaza. But you stand there on the roof of buildings closest to the fencing, and you look across into the very near distance at Khan Yunis, the outskirts of Khan Yunis. Gaza is down the road, and the very short distance that the terrorists traveled on October the 7th. There is some rebuilding. There are homes that have been rebuilt. There are many, many homes that are essentially as they were on October the 7th. And it's incredibly poignant and awful to walk past homes in which people were killed and know the stories of how they fought, to walk past homes from which people were abducted. Obviously the Bibas family, and to walk in the area where that terrible footage was filmed of the family being abducted, and just putting that up against the scenes that you saw from that day. Heartbreaking, if we are right to think that the Bibas families, that Shiri and her 2 sons were alive for at least several weeks in Gaza, and maybe until not terribly long before the first deals were struck and began to unfold in November 2023. That's my understanding. That's not something that was said to us on Friday when I was there, but I think that's the case. But there are people starting to move back. I mean, there are some people who are moving back. I don't know the numbers, but some into some homes that have been made habitable again. But most of the things that we saw, like I say, were pretty much the way they were on October the 7th. And the kibbutz is still, there are people who will not come back. There are people who will come back. The kibbutz is still debating how to memorialize. There are people who think it's unthinkable that they would come back and live on a kibbutz where the terribly, terribly resonantly awful homes are still in that state. In other words, they would be living in a kind of memorial to things that need to be memorialized. And there are other people who think that, of course, we have to leave, and therefore that whatever more memorialization takes place should not take place in the midst of what would seek to again be a living kibbutz. And there are other people who think, how can we not leave things the way they are for everyone to see and internalize? And as far as we were told and gathered, that debate is continuing, not in some kind of terrible acrimonious way, but in some anguished way. How do you, on the one hand, memorialize the most terrible thing that could possibly happen to a community, and on the other hand, at the same time, how do you revive that community? And it's there's no good answer to that question, and they're still agonizing about it.
Are they talking about this year's October 7th and how they are planning to memorialize it this particular year? I feel like that's another conversation that keeps on happening of how to do that, how to mark that horrible, terrible day, along with many others.
Yeah, it's not something that was discussed, but I'm sure they are. And most of the people are not at the kibbutz at the moment, and how to keep the community together. The mechanics of rebuilding, even the financing of the rebuilding, has been incredibly complicated. There were very protracted negotiations with the government about what the government was prepared to do and what the kibbutz felt was appropriate for the government to do. And all of those, some of that has been resolved now, but there's a great deal that is unresolved, and including all the aspects of memorialization on particular dates and more broadly.
Okay. David, thanks for telling us about that. The vividness of it is helpful in some way, certainly for me, so I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jessica. Take care.
Sure. And thanks, too, for listening to the Times Visual's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by Adina Karpouj. If you have comments about any of our episodes, you can always drop us an email, podcast@timesvisual.com. And of course, feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care and be well.